So in this video, we're going to talk about web app pen testing, and we're going to be using two tools. One is Burpsuite and the other one is SQLmap. So before we begin, we really need to talk about what is a web application. So a web application is a type of app that can be accessed through a web browser. It is effectively looks like a typical app that you would probably find on a device. The only thing is that it runs using the internet. You can have it on a mobile device, but you can also have it on a desktop too. And generally, the main difference between a website and a web app is the fact that the web app is interactive. So there are a couple of advantages to web applications. I won't go through the complete presentation. You can read this yourself a little bit later on. But basically, the main key differences or the key advantages are it's platform agnostic. It isn't actually being designed for any specific platform. It's low upfront cost to develop, easy to maintain. There isn't any market space. You can just basically go online and find a web application, and the developers can automatically update it. There are a few disadvantages. One is that it needs constant internet connection. Obviously, as it's on the web, there isn't actually a marketplace for it, so therefore sometimes difficult to discover these web applications. Has less functionality than a typical desktop or web mobile application, and sometimes the user experience isn't as good as if it was effectively developed specifically with an operating system in mind. So as pen testers, we're going to use a type of attack against a web application, and the type of attack we're going to be using is SQL injection. So the first technique, we're just going to use Burpsuite, but let's talk a little bit about SQL injection first of all. So basically, the idea is that a hacker would try and find or identify a vulnerability within a web application. Generally, the weakest part or the most accessible part of a web application online is its input fields. So by using the input fields of the web application, the aim is effectively trying to get the actual site itself or the app itself to actually expose data from the database that is hidden behind the scenes. So the way that we normally access this information is by using the actual SQL query language that is actually used in the web apps development, by actually using SQL language to compromise or to give instructions to the database. Unwittingly, the app doesn't actually know what it's doing or what it's passing on, but the database will respond and will effectively chuck out information or data that it wouldn't normally be expected to give. Effectively, through SQL queries, we can also allow the hacker to gain access to the actual wider system. So, for instance, we could get the database to throw out administrations, usernames, and passwords. And then the hacker could then use this information to access the root privileges of that particular database. So, first of all, we're going to try a technique using Burpsuite. Basically, Burpsuite is an application that effectively acts as a proxy or an intermediary between the actual client browser and the actual web server itself. So first of all, we're going to set up the proxy settings, making sure that everything that we do within the client gets passed on to Burpsuite itself, and making sure that the actual web server then will get the information handed by Burpsuite and not by the client directly. So that's the first thing we're going to do, is we're going to set up Burpsuite. But before we actually do that, one of the things we're going to do first of all is actually just do a small configuration to metasploitable 2. So I'm just going to access metasploitable 2 here. So to do that, we use msf admin and again msf admin. And we need to change the configuration for the database that's being used by a vulnerable application. We need to do this first within Metasploitable 2 for this particular practical exercise to be completed. So what we're going to do is we're going to use sudo to elevate our privilege. We're going to use a text editor, Nano, and we're just going to go to this location and this particular file. So I'm just going to check that this is actually the correct location. Give me 1 second. So I made a small error here. So it's got a weird name. So it's mtil and then we're going to go into that particular file there. So once we've done that, I put in the admin password and we've now got access to this configuration file. And typically on Metasploitable, the actual database name that it uses for this particular vulnerable application is called Metasploit. And I want to change this to OWASP10. And this then will be the database, or at least the database name that we're going to use for this particular practical exercise. And then can do Control and X, Y, and then Enter. Now that that's done, you can see that that has now changed. And if I just want to confirm it, that that has actually taken effect, I should be able now to cat this particular file. And you can see there that that OWASP10 is being configured. So now that I've done that modification, I don't need to see Metasploit anymore. Effectively, whatever I do now against this particular server, the user wouldn't see anyway. So I'm just going to minimize this and I'm going to log straight into the Kali machine and we're going to get Burpsuite set up. So as I mentioned before, the idea of this is that the browser, in this case Firefox, will communicate with a package called Burpsuite. So if I go to another desktop, and let's open up Burpsuite first of all. And don't need to worry about this. It's just basically saying that the Java engine that we're using is slightly out of date. It takes a couple of seconds. It's running in a VM and it's only got a couple CPUs as processing. So I can accept that by default. And because this is the community edition of Burpsuite, we're only able to access the temporary project summary, so that's fine. And then we're just going to use the defaults, and we're going to start Burpsuite off. While that's loading in the background, I'm just going to come across here so we can first of all just see if we've got access to the metasploitable 2 server. We can see there that we've got a couple of machines available, but if I was to just check out the last one, what I'm looking for is for an open port 80, and you can see pretty much straight away port 80 is open on that particular IP address. So if I just want to open up a web browser, I'm going to come back here and let's just grab that IP address. And go back to this browser and paste that and go. And you can see that we've got access to metasploitable 2. Perfect, just what we would expect. But what we want to happen now is that this browser will actually go through Burpsuite as a proxy. So the way that we would do that is if we go to proxy on Burpsuite Community Edition, and if we go to proxy settings, we can see that it's been configured to use IP address 127.0.0.1 and then port 8080. And the thing to know about this particular IP is effectively we're telling the system to look at itself rather than go out onto the network or onto the internet. It's actually looking back into the same machine here. So it's a loop back. So now we've got the IP address and the port for Burpsuite. What we can now do is go to our Firefox browser, into settings, and if I go right to the end, we can change the network settings, and we have the facility here to effectively use a proxy. Now, at the moment, it's set up to the system's proxy settings. In other words, the actual computer itself, if it had any proxy settings, this would actually use the same one as the system. We could say that we don't want any proxy at all. But what I want to do is I manually want to set up a proxy configuration. So that's the one I will select. And I'm going to do 127.0.0.1 and port 8080. In other words, we're telling this browser to go to that particular IP address, that particular port, which is being used by Burpsuite, and then Burpsuite will be then responsible for sending any traffic on from there. So I can press OK, and I can then close this down, and we can still see the page at the moment, but if I was to refresh the page, you can see that nothing really changes on the page here, because Burpsuite is effectively now in the middle, but we can't actually tell on the client side. So if I go back here and if I turn Intercept on now, so in other words, what's going to happen is Burpsuite is now going to intercept the traffic, where before with Intercept off, all traffic was passing through uninterrupted. Now I want to intercept that traffic. I can now go back to Metasploitable 2 and I can click any one of these icons. So if I just start with the first one, the T-Wiki, and you can see that Burpsuite has opened on my machine to basically say that it's intercepted some traffic, and you can see that here. So this is the actual HTTP request from the client going back to the server. And as you can see behind, nothing has changed in the browser. There is an interruption between the client and the web server communicating. And effectively, at this moment, Burpsuite is waiting for me to decide what to do with this particular information. If I was to press forward, the information will go onto the web server, and then the web server would send back a response. As you can see on the page behind, it is now updated. Same again, if I was to go back, it's using cache data. So no information is being sent from the server to the client. This is actually the client just using information that it remembered. But if I was to then go on to Mutil Day, or put Mutidili Day, then if I was to click that, then again, we get some traffic generated. Nothing changes on the page. And again, if I click forward, you can see that the page behind has now updated. So this is effectively the system that we changed the database for. And what we want to try is with the OWASP top 10. So these are the top 10 vulnerabilities or hacking techniques for websites. We can use a variety of these techniques, but the one that I'm most interested in is doing injection, and we want to do a SQL injection. And the purpose of that SQL injection we want to do is to extract some data, and we're going to extract it from the user's info. So if I now click this one, again, you'll see nothing happens, but if I click forward and then forward again, and these are all the requests that effectively has been stored in Burpsuite. We can see now that we're on a login page. Okay, so this is the OWASP top 10 injection, SQL injection, extract data, and the user info, and that's brought us here. So what we're going to do with this page is we're going to use this login, and this is what we're going to attack and see if we can actually get the database behind this login page to actually give us some credentials or some information. So obviously at this time, I don't know any login details. So the first thing I'm going to do is just put something random in. So I'm going to say admin here, and I'm going to say for the password, I'm going to say root, and I'll click the button here. And again, Burpsuite has intercepted that traffic again to the user or the client. Nothing has changed. There's no problem, but it's just waiting. As you can see here, it's waiting to get a response from the server. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to just grab this information. So I'm going to just grab all of that information. I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to put it into a text file. And this we will use later on. So I'm just going to save that onto the desktop. And I'm just going to say response.txt. There we go. And that's saved onto the desktop. And for the moment, I'll just minimize that. We don't really need that just yet. So what else we're going to do is just take a look at the information or the response that we've got here. And you can see that from the client going out to the server, we have this line, which is basically a request to the server to get some information. And we can see here that we've got the username that I used and also the password that I used in plain text. That would be sent to the web server. So what I want to do here is I want to pick a point at which I could insert some SQL instructions and effectively try and compromise the input and see if I can find data or get the database to generate some data for me by compromising a couple of these variables, or at least one of them. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go to action, and I'm going to send this particular response to the intruder. And you can see here that it's just the intruder tab has just gone orange, just to say that something has changed here. So I'm just going to click that tab. The type of attack we're going to use is sniper. We could use a variety of different attacks depending on how we want to insert our SQL instructions within the original response. But we're just going to keep it simple and just stick with the sniper action for the moment. I'm only going to change or try to insert some SQL into one place within this response, and that is going to be in the user name. So I look for the username here, and we can see that the original username that I used, even though it was incorrect, was admin. So I'm just going to highlight the word admin, and I'm going to add what's called a payload marker. In other words, this is where I want the SQL injection to be inserted. So I'm just going to click add. Once that's done, I can now move on to the next stage. So I've selected the position for the SQL injection to take place within this response, and I now move on to payload. Now, in this section, I can actually decide how or what the actual SQL injection will look like. And we could just enter single responses here and try them out. But really, the power of Burpsuite is that we can actually have a more automated process of trying this web page and seeing which one of the SQL injections instructions would actually have an impact. So we're going to load up a predefined dictionary, and this is sort of a dictionary or a brute force attack. So I'm just going to go to load. I'm going to go to the root of the drive. Then I'm going to find user, so USR, then share, and then we're going to look for the word list. So if I select one of these and press W, and we're looking for word list. And in this word lists, or this folder full of word lists, I'm going to look for wfuzz, which is a subfolder. And inside here, I'm going to look for injections. So these will be some SQL injections in text files. And you'll see one that's actually called SQL text. And I select that one, and I'm going to open it. And if you go through here, these are the different types of commands or SQL injection instructions that we could insert into the input field of a web app. And the hope or the result is that the database would actually display information that it wouldn't normally display. So these are different types of instructions, and these instructions are actually going to be placed in the user field here and then played or replayed against the actual database just to see what would happen. So now that I've set up my payload, I don't need to do anything else at this stage. I've set up the position, I've set up the payload. So the next thing that I need to do is just start the attack. So I'm just going to press start the attack. Press OK. And as you can see, we're having responses of 200, which in HTTP speech means OK. So in other words, the instruction was successfully played against the web server. And as you can see here, there's 125 commands, and it's going through each one and just seeing what the response would be. So if I take the very first one, just to show you what happens, and as you can see here, it's very much the same response as we had previously. The only thing is when we look at the username, you can see that it was played with admin. But once we go to the next instruction, you can see here that the username has different sets of characters associated to it. And as we go through, again, if we look at the username, you can see that there's a different combination of characters. And these characters are trying to trick the database into actually performing something that it wouldn't normally do. If we wanted to see what the response was from the web server, we can go to response. We can see the data as it is, or as it was sent. So basically, this is the HTML or the script that was sent back. We can see the raw information. So we've got the pretty and the raw. Or we can have the hex information, how it looks in hexadecimal. But probably the most useful for most people is to see it rendered, to actually see what it would look like in the browser. And as you can see here, hopefully you can get the idea. Some credentials were entered in, and then this was the response to the page. So this one came up, authentication error, bad username and password. If I come down a little bit and try one of the other ones, you can see we haven't got that message. But on 29, the instruction or the SQL injection that we used here actually has yielded some responses. And that's what we would effectively hope for. We can try some of the other ones just to see what would happen. And you can see, again, some bad authentication. But if we go to 39, again, we end up with success. We're actually able to extract some data from the database. So that was a successful hack using SQL injection. If you were to try these commands in the actual site itself, in here, then you would actually get exactly the same response. The only difference here is that we're able to try multiple commands to see which one works, and it just saves us that legwork of having to type these instructions out manually and insert them into the input box of the web page. So now that we've done that, I want to move on, and I want to go and try out another system or another tool called SQLmap. So we've already saved the initial response. And now that we've got that initial response, what I want to do is try this out with SQLmap. So I'm just going to close Burpsuite. We don't need that anymore. And the web browser will change because Burpsuite is now not acting as the proxy. So I'm just going to change that here. It's okay. And then close that. And this should return it back to what we had before. So that's fine. And for the moment, I don't actually need the browser, so I'm just going to close that there. So we saved the initial response. So this was the first response that we got. And as you can see here in the username, we've got admin, and in the password, we've got root. So we're going to use this file. So what I'm going to do is open up a command prompt. Do sudo su, so we're in root for this. And the tool we're going to use is SQLmap, which is pre-installed in Kali. And we're just going to have a look at the help just to get an idea. So we have a lot of different instructions that we could use. But the main thing is that we're going to use this against our database. So first of all, what is SQLmap? So now that we've set up Burpsuite, we've used that. So the rest of the PowerPoint here will take you through those settings that we did. So SQLmap. SQLmap is a software utility for automated discovery of SQL injection vulnerabilities in a web application. In other words, it will test the web application to see what vulnerabilities are potentially there. And then once we're armed with that information, we can then design or develop an attack around it. So to use it, we would typically have gone into Burpsuite, captured a failed login request, saved it as a text file onto the desktop, and we would use that after closing Burpsuite. So we've already done this very early on, and that is that response.txt file that I've placed on the desktop. The next thing then is really just entering a simple command, which would allow SQLmap to actually use that text file and get all of the information it needs to test for a vulnerability in a particular web server. So we would simply type SQLmap -r or flag R or escape R, and we would use that to effectively allow us to put in a request file that we've saved earlier. So we put in the path to that particular file as a text file, and then effectively SQLmap would use this information to attack the web server. So let's just see what that looks like in action. So I will again go back to my Kali Linux. I'm just going to clear the screen. We see we've got the response file here. So what I'm going to do is SQLmap -r, and then I'm just going to put in the path so that we can see that it's home, Kali, desktop, and then response. And that's all that we need. Now, this is a very lengthy report that it will generate. So we can obviously generate it to the screen, but we could also generate it to a separate file. But we're just going to leave it on the screen for the moment. And as I said, it will take a bit of time. So we just press enter. And as you can see, it takes the information that we've given it in the response file, and it's now checking to see vulnerabilities. And it's giving us some indication very early on of what type of vulnerabilities are available. So it pauses here. It is recommended to perform only basic union tests if there is not at least one other potential technique found. Do you want to reduce the number of requests? So we can obviously do a lot of requests, or just use the most basic. So do you want to reduce the number of requests? So let's just say yes. And you can see that it's going through the database and just checking what is vulnerability. And already it's picked up that tests have found that the get parameter username might be injectable, possible possible into a database management system. And it also has highlighted here that the username is also vulnerable to cross-site scripting. Okay. So we can continue. Do you want to skip testing the payload for specific over sessions? Let's go yes. Let's go no to this. And again, it will just keep going. But we've pretty much found the information that we needed, in that the username get parameter would be one that is vulnerable. But this will go through a number of different configurations, a number of different tests, just trying to find out all the vulnerabilities that are available, and then highlighting those vulnerabilities to us. As you can see here, it keeps popping out that the username is effectively the most vulnerable part of the particular website at the moment. Okay. Right. So that is how we would use SQLmap. So very useful for checking websites. And as you saw earlier, you will actually highlight very clearly any vulnerability and tell you exactly which part of the site itself is vulnerable to attack. So those are the two main common tools that we would use in web app testing, Burpsuite and also SQLmap.